understand that the Commonwealth, in this case, is required to prove each and every element of the case against you beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you understand that?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
You already know the outline of this case. You know the names. You know what happened in that house in Duxbury on January 24th, 2023. What you may not know is how much of it is still genuinely, legally unresolved. Because right now, as this trial plays out in a Plymouth County courtroom, some of the biggest questions in this entire story still don't have an answer. Not because nobody's asked them, because the people who could answer them are either not talking or are giving answers under oath that cut both ways. We're going to go through 6 of those unanswered questions in the order the evidence actually surfaces them. And we're going to end with something that came out of a psychiatrist's testimony a few days ago. A detail that's been spreading online that a lot of people are reading one way and that the actual cross-examination testimony complicates in a way most retellings of it leave out. Before we get into it, quick housekeeping. If you appreciate careful true crime breakdowns that separate what the evidence actually says from what people assume it says, please subscribe to this channel. Because in a case this emotionally charged, the difference between a fact, an argument, and a theory matters. Lindsay Clancy is on trial in Plymouth Superior Court on 3 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. She has pleaded not guilty. She does not dispute that she caused their deaths. What she disputes, what her entire defense is built around, is whether she was criminally responsible for what she did. The prosecution's position, laid out by Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham in her opening statement, is that Clancy acted intentionally, rationally, and swiftly to accomplish a very specific goal. The defense's position, laid out by attorney Kevin Reddington, is that she was in the grip of severe, undertreated postpartum psychosis, and that she had, in his words, no motive that she loved her children. Testimony has been going for roughly 2 weeks now. Patrick Clancy, her ex-husband, testified first for the prosecution and then faced cross-examination that focused heavily on Lindsay's mental health struggles in the months before the killings. Jurors have heard from first responders, from medical examiners, from psychiatrists, from a former nanny, and they've heard Lindsay's own diary entries read aloud in open court. If she's convicted, she faces life in prison. If the jury finds she was not criminally responsible, she isn't acquitted in the way people usually mean that word. She's committed to a secure state mental health facility instead of a prison. Patrick Clancy was the prosecution's first witness, and his testimony set the emotional tone for everything that's followed. He described building a snowman with 2 of the children on the afternoon of January 24th, describing an ordinary, even pleasant day right up until the moment it wasn't. He described leaving the house to run what he thought was a routine errand, picking up children's medication and dinner, and coming home to find his children fatally injured. He described the 911 call, which the jury has heard in full, and which captures him screaming for help after finding his wife in the backyard, having jumped from the 2nd-story window. His testimony ran across 2 days, and under cross-examination from Reddington, he was walked through his ex-wife's mental health struggles in the months leading up to that day, the sleeplessness, the postpartum issues, the treatment she'd been seeking. It's worth noting that Patrick, throughout, has never suggested she did this out of malice toward him or their marriage. His public statements since 2023 have consistently described her as, in his words, generously loving and caring. There was also a smaller, quieter moment in the 2nd week that got less attention than the graphic testimony but mattered in its own way. Midway through the trial, with the jury temporarily out of the room, Clancy was asked by Judge William F. Sullivan a series of questions about a stipulation, a legal agreement where both sides accept certain facts as true so the trial doesn't have to spend time proving things like the chain of custody for blood samples or DNA evidence. Clancy answered him directly, in an even voice, confirming she understood her rights. It wasn't dramatic testimony, but it was the first time the public had heard her voice at all since this trial began. The jury also watched her get visibly emotional at other points that same week, sobbing, shaking, covering her face while a medical examiner testified about her youngest child's autopsy. That's the emotional and evidentiary backdrop. Now here's what's still genuinely unresolved. Question 1. What was actually in her search history? This is where a lot of online discussion goes wrong, because people tend to collapse two very different things into one search history. The first thing is well documented, and it's not really a mystery, it's just chilling in its ordinariness. At 4:02 in the afternoon on January 24, 2023, Lindsay searched her phone for Kids Miralax, a children's laxative. 11 minutes later, at 4:13, she searched Takeout 3V, a restaurant in Plymouth. Immediately after that second search, prosecutors say she opened Apple Maps and calculated how long it would take to drive from the family's home in Duxbury to that restaurant. A little after 4:47, she called a CVS pharmacy in Kingston to ask whether they had children's Miralax in stock. The manager who took that call later told investigators Clancy sounded completely normal. No slurring, no sign of impairment. Around 4:53, she texted Patrick asking if he wanted takeout from 3V. He left the house sometime after that, and the trip CVS, then the restaurant, then back, took him roughly 54 minutes. Prosecutors have used that sequence to argue something very specific. That this wasn't Lindsay noticing an opportunity and taking it, it was Lindsay engineering the opportunity. That she picked the errand, timed it, and sent her husband out the door knowing exactly how long she'd have alone with the children. That's the searches everyone can verify, because they've been laid out in charging documents and repeated in court. But there's a second thread separate from this one that's murkier. Investigators, working off an unsealed search warrant, said they found material, described in general terms as her using her phone and a personal journal to track her mental state and her medications, and language describing her as having researched ways to kill. The specifics of what that research actually consisted of, what she typed, when, in what context, have never been laid out publicly in the same granular detail as the Miralax and 3V searches. Separately from the trial itself, there's an account that surfaced during pre-trial legal fights over a New Yorker reporter's interview notes with Patrick. In that account, Patrick describes asking Lindsay directly why she'd looked up how long the takeout trip would take, and her explanation was that she wanted to help him avoid rush hour traffic. He also describes asking her at some point whether she'd searched ways to kill, and her telling him that search was about herself, tied to roughly 2 months of suicidal thoughts she says she'd been having before the killings. That's Patrick's account of a private conversation, reported before the trial started. It has not been confirmed as sworn courtroom testimony in the trial itself, and it's not something either side has resolved on the record. So here's where question 1 actually sits. The errand-related searches are documented fact. The broader ways to kill research is real in the sense that investigators say they found it, but what it actually contained and what it meant is still unresolved. Was it about her children? Was it about herself? Was it both? Was it neither in the way either side is framing it? Nobody outside the courtroom, and arguably, based on the testimony so far, not everybody inside it either, has a fully verified answer. There's a second layer to this question that's worth mentioning, because it comes from the same search warrants. Investigators also described finding a notebook in the house containing what's been characterized as suicidal thoughts, and that discovery is part of what led them to request the deeper forensic examination of her devices in the first place. So the sequence, as far as public records show it, runs: officers find a personal notebook during the search of the home. That notebook becomes part of the basis for a warrant to dig into her phone and other devices, and that deeper search is what eventually produces both the time-stamped errand searches and the broader, less detailed ways to kill material. 2 different documents, 2 different levels of detail, and, as of this recording, 2 different levels of public clarity about what they actually say. Question 2. Was she in psychosis, or was she fully aware of what she was doing? This is the actual center of the trial. Every other question orbits this one. The defense's case, as Reddington has framed it from opening statements onward, is that Lindsay was suffering from severe, untreated postpartum psychosis at the time of the killings, a recognized, if underdiagnosed, psychiatric condition that can involve delusions, hallucinations, and a break from reality, often following childbirth. His argument is that she sought treatment repeatedly, and that the system failed her badly enough that by January 24, 2023, she was not capable of understanding the wrongfulness of what she was doing. The prosecution's case is that this framing doesn't hold up against what she actually did that day. Buckingham has told the jury that Clancy struggled with her mental health. Prosecutors aren't disputing that broad fact, but that she was not, in her words, in the throes of psychosis, when she killed her children. Prosecutor Jennifer Sprague has gone further, arguing in court that Clancy knew that she had murdered her children and had, in Sprague's words, the clarity, focus, and mental acumen to immediately start protecting her own legal interests afterward. Both sides have real testimony behind them, and that's exactly why this is unresolved rather than obviously one-sided. On the defense's side, her diary, read aloud in court, includes entries describing feeling like she was drowning every day. Language about the overwhelming, isolating weight of new motherhood and mental illness that isn't performative in hindsight. It was written in real time, before anyone knew what would happen. Her former nanny testified that Lindsay was, in her words, a wonderful mother who was never a safety concern, but also confirmed under cross-examination that Lindsay had talked to her about serious postpartum struggles and an inability to sleep. On the prosecution's side, the search and timing sequence from question 1, her documented lucidity in phone calls that same afternoon, and psychiatric testimony describing her, in the days immediately after the killings, as calm, organized, and goal-directed. That last point is worth sitting with because it's not as simple as it sounds, and we're going to come back to it in detail at the end of this video. It's also worth understanding, in general terms, what postpartum psychosis actually is, since the term gets used loosely in a lot of the online commentary around this case. It's a rare but recognized psychiatric condition that can emerge in the weeks or months after childbirth. And in its most severe form, it can involve delusions, hallucinations, and a genuine break from reality, distinct from more common postpartum depression or anxiety, though the three can overlap and co-occur. This case isn't the venue for a clinical definition to be settled either way about Lindsay Clancy specifically. That's exactly what the trial is fighting over, with the defense arguing that her psychiatric condition reached the threshold of postpartum psychosis, while prosecutors argue that Lindsay's behavior and the surrounding timeline are inconsistent with the defense's account of her mental state. What matters for this video is that the condition itself is real and clinically established. The open question is whether it applies here and to what degree, and that's a question for the jury. The defense has also leaned heavily on a specific argument, that Lindsay didn't simply have an untreated illness, she had an illness she was actively trying to get help for. Reddington's opening statement framed it that way directly, that this was someone suffering from extreme mental illness despite her best efforts to seek treatment. That framing matters to the defense's broader case because a jury weighing criminal responsibility isn't just being asked whether she was sick. They're implicitly being asked whether the system around her, her prescribers, her support network, the pace of her care, failed to catch what was happening in time. That's a harder, messier argument than a simple insanity claim, and it's one the medication testimony in question 4 connects directly back to. For now, the honest state of question 2 is this: jurors are still actively hearing evidence on both sides of it. Nothing in the testimony so far definitively closes the door on either interpretation. That's not a cop-out. It's genuinely, as of this recording, where the case stands. Question 3. Why that specific errand on that specific night? This one sounds like it should be a subset of question 1, but it's really its own puzzle because the timing question isn't really about what she searched. It's about what she orchestrated with another person, her husband, who had no idea what he was walking into. Prosecutors' theory requires Patrick to be out of the house for a specific window. Not just away for a predictable, bounded amount of time. That's why the CVS then restaurant errand matters to their case in a way that a simple "he happened to step out" narrative wouldn't. The prosecution's argument is that Lindsay didn't take advantage of Patrick leaving. She created the reason for him to leave, then timed exactly how long he'd be gone using a mapping app, then confirmed the timing was accurate by actually calling the pharmacy and having him pick up food at a specific restaurant. What's still not fully explained, not contradicted, just not filled in, is the reasoning behind the specific choices. Why that restaurant? Why a children's laxative as the pretext specifically, rather than any of a dozen other errands that would have taken him out of the house? Neither the prosecution's presentation nor the defense's cross-examination has walked the jury through Lindsay's stated reasoning for those particular choices, as opposed to the fact pattern of what she did and when. The defense's implicit counter isn't that the timeline is wrong. Reddington isn't disputing the sequence of events. It's that reading deliberate planning into ordinary, mundane errand logistics assumes a level of calculated intent that a person in psychosis, according to their expert testimony, can still exhibit without it meaning what the prosecution says it means. So question 3 isn't "did this happen?" It clearly did. It's stipulated, agreed to evidence at this point. It's what does it actually prove? And that's still being argued. There's also a human layer to this question that the trial has touched on but not fully resolved either. What the day looked like from the outside, in the hours before any of this happened. Patrick texted Lindsay a photo of their son that morning. She sent one back of their daughter at a doctor's appointment. That afternoon, by multiple accounts, the family went outside and built a snowman together, and witnesses have described it as an ordinary, even pleasant few hours. The former nanny, Erin Rossi, testified during the second week about her time working for the family, describing Lindsay as a devoted, attentive mother, someone who'd cut up vegetables for the kids, who sent Rossi videos of the children and stayed in touch even after her employment ended, who Rossi said she loved. Under cross-examination, Rossi also confirmed Lindsay had talked to her about postpartum struggles and difficulty sleeping, though she said Lindsay never mentioned any urge to harm herself in those conversations. None of that resolves what happened later that same day, but it's part of why question 3 doesn't have a clean answer. The gap between an ordinary afternoon with a snowman and a calculated, timed errand a few hours later is exactly the gap this entire trial is trying to explain. Question 4. What did her medication cocktail actually do to her? This is the piece of the case that sits somewhere between the criminal trial and a completely separate civil lawsuit, and it's worth understanding why those two things are connected but not identical. The medication history is one of the most controversial parts of this case. According to the defense, Lindsay was prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications over roughly 4 months as doctors tried to address her worsening insomnia, anxiety, and depression. Medications publicly identified in reporting about her treatment have included Zoloft, Prozac, Klonopin, Seroquel, and Ambien, among others. And that number matters not because being prescribed multiple medications automatically explains what happened, but because the defense says the rapid changes and combinations became part of the problem rather than the solution. Reddington has repeatedly portrayed Lindsay as a woman moving through a complicated psychiatric treatment system while her condition continued to deteriorate. But that leaves a question neither a medication list nor a prescription record can answer by itself. What effect were those medications actually having on Lindsay's mind by January 24th? Were doctors appropriately trying different treatments for an increasingly difficult psychiatric condition? Did medication changes contribute to her deterioration, as her defense argues? Or does the deliberate-looking behavior prosecutors have highlighted that day tell a very different story? That question has become even more significant because Patrick Clancy has separately sued healthcare providers involved in Lindsay's psychiatric treatment, alleging problems including overmedication and failures in coordinating her care. Those are allegations in a separate civil case, not findings of wrongdoing. But the lawsuit makes one thing clear. The debate over Lindsay's treatment did not end when the criminal case began. What's actually unresolved medically and legally is the causal question, not whether she was on a lot of medication, that part isn't disputed, but what that specific combination actually did to her cognition and judgment on the day itself. Was it a contributing factor to a psychotic break, as the defense frames it? Was it, as prosecutors would need to argue to preserve their theory of the case, not disabling enough to explain away the deliberate-looking behavior in the search history and the errand timing? That's a question for expert psychiatric and pharmacological testimony that the trial is still working through, and it's one of the more technical, less headline-grabbing pieces of this case. But it may end up being one of the more consequential ones for how the jury eventually reads everything else. Question 5. What does Lindsay's behavior immediately after the killings actually tell us? For years, one of the most disturbing parts of this case has been what happened immediately after the children died. Lindsay cut herself and jumped from a second-story window. She survived, but suffered a devastating spinal injury that left her paralyzed. Those physical facts aren't really the mystery. Her state of mind is, because depending on which side of this case you listen to, what happened afterward can be interpreted in dramatically different ways. Was this the immediate collapse of a woman emerging from a catastrophic psychiatric episode and suddenly confronting what she had done? Or were these the actions of someone who understood exactly what had happened and understood the consequences that were coming? Even the prosecution's characterization of Lindsay's suicide attempt has generated confusion. Earlier reporting and pretrial arguments described the Commonwealth as suggesting the attempt had been faked. But during the trial, prosecutors clarified their position. They were not saying Lindsay's attempt wasn't serious or that she wasn't trying to die. Their argument, instead, is that the methods she chose were insufficient to accomplish that goal, and that the significance of those choices would become clearer through medical testimony. That distinction matters because it changes the question from whether Lindsay genuinely wanted to die to what her choices immediately afterward might reveal about her state of mind. What we can examine much more confidently is what Lindsay did and said after she survived. 2 days after the killings, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Jailam Biswas met Lindsay while she was hospitalized, intubated and unable to speak normally. So Lindsay communicated by writing, and some of what she wrote raises another set of questions. She wanted to know whether she had an attorney. She asked questions about her physical condition. She wanted information about visitors and her family. And she wrote that she was horrified. Think about how differently those details can be interpreted. For prosecutors, questions about an attorney and her immediate circumstances may become evidence of awareness. A woman capable of understanding that something terrible had happened and that she was now facing consequences. But the defense can point to something entirely different in those same hospital records. Horror, psychiatric instability, severe physical trauma, and a woman whose mental condition cannot simply be reconstructed from a few written questions. There were additional complications. During Lindsay's early hospitalization, psychiatrist Dr. Sejal Shah testified that Lindsay experienced hallucinations. But Shah attributed those early hospital symptoms to possible medical causes associated with her condition and treatment after the fall, including factors surrounding major surgery and her physical injuries. Rather than simply declaring them proof of the postpartum psychosis the defense says existed before the killings. And that creates the real unanswered question. What does Lindsay's behavior immediately afterward actually tell us about the state of mind she had minutes earlier inside that house? The prosecution sees evidence of awareness. The defense sees the aftermath of catastrophic mental illness. And perhaps most frustratingly, some of the same evidence can be used to argue both. Question 6. How could she see a psychiatrist the day before, and nobody saw this coming? This may be one of the hardest pieces of the entire case to reconcile, because Lindsay wasn't someone who had completely disappeared from medical care before January 24th. She was actively receiving psychiatric treatment, and remarkably, she was evaluated by a psychiatrist just 1 day before her children died. On January 23rd, psychiatrist Dr. Jennifer Tufts met with Lindsay. Think about that timeline. Not 1 month before, not 1 week before, the day before. According to Tufts' testimony, Lindsay appeared depressed and reported anxiety. But Tufts testified that Lindsay denied suicidal thoughts. She denied homicidal thoughts. And Tufts said Lindsay did not report the voices that the defense says would become central to what happened the following day. Tufts testified that she did not observe Lindsay displaying signs that led her to conclude she was psychotic, and she did not believe Lindsay met the criteria for involuntary hospitalization. Then, roughly a day later, 3 children were dead. That creates one of the most difficult questions in this entire case. If Lindsay was descending into the severe postpartum psychosis her defense now describes, how did a psychiatrist evaluating her only 1 day earlier fail to see what was coming? There are at least 2 radically different ways to interpret that. The prosecution can point to it and ask the obvious question. Maybe the psychiatrist didn't see psychosis because Lindsay wasn't psychotic. Maybe the reason she appeared coherent, denied homicidal thoughts, and wasn't hospitalized was because the psychiatric state now being described by the defense simply wasn't present in the way the defense claims. But the defense has an equally important response. Psychosis isn't necessarily a permanent state where someone appears disconnected from reality every second of every day. A person experiencing severe psychiatric illness may still hold a conversation. They may answer questions. They may appear organized. And, as other psychiatric testimony in this trial would later make clear, apparently coherent behavior does not automatically rule psychosis out. That leaves an extraordinary 24-hour gap. What changed between that psychiatric appointment and the killings? Did Lindsay's condition deteriorate catastrophically overnight? Was something already happening that wasn't visible during the evaluation? Was Lindsay withholding symptoms? Did she herself understand what was happening to her? Or is the absence of observed psychosis the day before exactly what prosecutors say it is? Evidence that the defense's explanation does not fit. And Lindsay wasn't living completely isolated from everyone around her either. Patrick knew she had been struggling. She had sought treatment. She had been hospitalized. People around her knew about the insomnia, anxiety, and depression. Yet Patrick testified that he believed she had been improving. Other people who knew Lindsay described a mother who appeared loving and attentive toward her children. Her former nanny described her as a wonderful mother and said she had never considered Lindsay a danger to the children. And then January 24th happened. That's what makes this question bigger than whether one psychiatrist missed one symptom. There were people around Lindsay. There were doctors. There were medications. There had been psychiatric treatment. There were warning signs serious enough that everyone now looks backward and asks what they meant. But somehow, the warning that would have mattered most, that 3 children might be in immediate danger, apparently wasn't recognized in time. And depending on how you view this case, that leads to 2 completely different conclusions. Either Lindsay's psychiatric deterioration was far more dangerous and difficult to detect than the people treating her understood, or the reason nobody saw an imminent psychotic catastrophe is because that's not what was happening. And that's precisely the question this jury eventually has to confront. But there is one more piece of psychiatric testimony we haven't talked about yet. And unlike the appointment the day before the killings, this happened afterward. It involves Lindsay. It involves Patrick. And it involves a decision about who Lindsay trusted to make some of the most important decisions about her own medical care. That's where this story gets even more complicated. Now here's the piece of testimony that's been spreading the fastest online over the last week or so.
Whether she was able to make the decision to change her healthcare proxy from her at the time husband to her parents.
And it's worth slowing down on, because most of what's circulating about it only tells half the story. 5 days after the killings, January 29th, 2023, while Lindsay Clancy was still hospitalized, still recovering from a spinal injury that had left her paralyzed, she asked to change her healthcare proxy. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, a healthcare proxy is the person legally authorized to make medical decisions on your behalf if you're unable to make them yourself. Up to that point, that person was her husband, Patrick. 5 days after her children died, she asked for that to change from Patrick to her parents. The psychiatrist who evaluated her for that request, Dr. Sejal Shah, testified about it directly in court during the second week of the trial. Shah described the conversation with Clancy as clear and organized. Clancy explained her reasoning, that her parents were, in her words, very supportive of her, and that she believed they'd act in her best interests. Shah testified that in that same evaluation, Clancy denied having suicidal or homicidal thoughts that day, denied hallucinations or delusions, and that her thought process came across as, in Shah's clinical language, organized and goal-directed. What Shah also testified is that they didn't go deeply into the specific reasons why the proxy needed to move away from Patrick in particular. Clancy gave the general explanation about her parents, but the conversation didn't dig further into why Patrick specifically was being removed from that role. And this is exactly where some viewers following the trial have stopped and asked a much more uncomfortable question. What had changed between Lindsay and Patrick? Was this simply a hospitalized woman wanting her parents beside her during the worst crisis of her life? Was she dissatisfied with decisions Patrick had made about her treatment? Did she believe her parents understood her psychiatric condition better? Was her perception of Patrick itself being affected by her mental condition? Or was this a completely practical decision that looks far more suspicious when viewed through everything that had happened 5 days earlier? The remarkable thing is that Dr. Shah couldn't give the jury a definitive answer to that. The medical team established that Lindsay consistently wanted her parents. They established that she could communicate that choice. But testimony did not produce some hidden explanation for why Patrick, specifically, needed to be replaced. And that's why this seemingly small medical decision has become such a talking point outside the courtroom. Not because it proves something, because it leaves behind one enormous word. Why? Here's where it gets more complicated, and where a lot of the online discussion stops short. On cross-examination, defense attorney Reddington asked Dr. Shah directly about what that kind of clarity actually means clinically. And Shah agreed, under oath, in direct response to a specific question, that a person experiencing active psychosis can still communicate clearly, can still appear organized, and can still make coherent plans. That's not a defense talking point. That's the prosecution's own witness, a treating psychiatrist, testifying that organized behavior and clear communication do not, on their own, rule out psychosis. Every patient, Shah noted, reacts differently. So what does that actually mean for how you should read the Proxy story? It means the explosive version of this fact, that clear, organized decision-making 5 days out proves she wasn't psychotic, isn't something the testimony actually supports as a settled conclusion. It's a real, documented, striking piece of evidence. It happened. She did ask to change the Proxy. She did explain her reasoning clearly, and Shah did describe her as organized and goal-directed in that moment. All of that is true. But the same witness, under the same oath, in the same week of testimony, also testified that clarity and organization are not incompatible with psychosis, which means this single fact doesn't resolve the central question of the trial the way a lot of clips and headlines have implied it does. It's genuinely disputed evidence. It cuts one way if you stop the story after the direct testimony. It cuts differently, or at least becomes far less conclusive, once you include the cross-examination that came right after it. That's not this video telling you what to think about it. That's what actually happened in that courtroom in the order it happened, from the same witness. The Proxy change is real. The complication is real. Both of them are sitting in the trial record right now, unresolved, waiting on a jury that hasn't heard closing arguments yet. 6 questions. A search history whose most disturbing phrase still lacks the detail people assume it has. An errand prosecutors see as calculated. A psychiatric condition the defense says explains everything. 13 psychiatric prescriptions over a matter of months. A psychiatrist who saw Lindsay the day before the killings and didn't see what was coming. And then, 5 days afterward, a decision to remove Patrick as her healthcare proxy and put her parents in his place. Each fact sounds powerful on its own. But every time you think one of them finally answers this case, another piece of testimony complicates it. And maybe that's why this trial has become so difficult to look away from. The question isn't simply what Lindsay Clancy did. We know what happened to those children. The question the courtroom is trying to answer is something far more difficult. What was happening inside her mind when she did it? And right now, the prosecution and defense are asking the same jury to look at many of the same facts and see 2 completely different women. If you want to keep following this as testimony continues, subscribe, because we'll be back with updates as the case moves toward closing arguments and, eventually, a verdict. This video was built from publicly reported courtroom testimony, unsealed court records, and reporting from named outlets covering this trial directly. Arguments from either side and interpretations discussed here are not findings of fact unless and until a jury reaches a verdict based on the evidence. If anything in this story is bringing up difficult feelings for you, especially around postpartum mental health, please know that support exists. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available by call or text, and the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline can be reached at 1-833 TLC Mama.